Hello and welcome to the Authentic Collectables YouTube channel for something a little bit different today. We thought we'd sit down and have a bit of a deep dive into our Gen 3 cars. I'm William from Authentic.
And I'm Greg from Authentic.
Funnily enough, we're both from Authentic. So here we have a selection of, I guess, the process of Gen 3, both from the Ford side of the fence and from the Chevy side of the fence. It's taken us 18 months-ish to get to where we are today. We've already had some of our Camaros into the market. We're just about to release some of our Mustangs into the market. So it's probably about where we would have expected us to be at this point in time.
To a certain extent.
A little bit maybe delayed with Mustang, and we'll go through the reasons why for that. So maybe, Greg, being our R&D man, you could talk us through how we sort of begin the process of getting to the point where we sit here today with actual models in front of us.
Yeah, all right. So let's start at the beginning. We obviously don't make these out of nothing. When we actually start a process for making a car, there's generally two ways to do it. One is to 3D scan a car, but with a lot of modern stuff, and especially in terms of supercar land, somebody's already done a lot of the CAD work to create the real car, and at a certain point we pinch that, effectively modelize the data. So if you're talking about a real race car 3D model, you might have upwards of 12,000 parts, and that includes nuts, bolts, washers, screws, everything in there. We can't necessarily do down to that level of detail. We still need to be able to get it out of a mold. We still need to be able to produce it. So we have to kind of simplify certain things, but ultimately the external shape is exactly the same as the race car. Are
you suggesting that there aren't gears in our transaxles?
No, there are no gears in the transaxle. You can't start it. And not unless you're a 1/18 scale, you can't get in and drive it. They're a static model at the end of the day. They're meant to look good, but you can't race them.
So I guess from that point of view, you know, we get the 3D data from teams and or manufacturers. It's a little bit depending on which brand we're talking about, where we get data and information from. The beauty, I guess, with Gen 3 is that because there are so many standardized components now in Gen 3, they are practically identical, every car in the field.
Yeah.
It's actually made that part of it a little bit easier for us, hasn't it?
Yeah, in the past, it's been a bit of an issue where different teams will do different setups internally, especially. So things will move around, people will put stuff wherever they like. Gen 3 was very, very standardised, and to the point where, if you recall, SVG got in trouble because they shifted the core box around. It's very much fixed in stone, so that makes our lives a lot easier in the fact that we can pretty well guarantee where stuff's going to live inside the car, and when we model it, it's pretty well right to the actual vehicle.
And we'll cover it off a little bit later when we sort of compare the two models, but things like with the older cars, with Erebus and their E-Cell seat, that was a pretty big thing for them, the technology that they'd gone into with that, and that's something that they wanted specifically in their models replicated.
Which we did.
Yeah. So two sets of different seats depending on not even what brand of car, but that was which team. So it got really down into the weeds in that regard.
Yeah, that adds a level of complexity, and the more complexity you add, it just increases the chance for stuff-ups. But generally, we got it right. It just makes things a little bit harder when you've got two sets of seats. You know, if you've got different interior parts, that just makes it a little bit more difficult. At least with these, everything is the same pretty well across the board, and pretty well across the board in terms of Chev and Ford. Internally, they're almost exactly the same. Obviously, there's a few little changes at the front and the back on the insides, but realistically, the cars are almost identical in terms of their underneath chassis layout and roll cage layout and everything else.
All that sort of stuff.
It does make it a little bit easier, but ultimately, you know, you're still doing two cars. It's still the same level of tooling because nothing quite fits, so you end up making two sets of tools for the chassis. Realistically, in real life, they should be the same, but once we actually add a die-cast shell and they need to match up, you're going to end up with two tools. That's just life.
Exactly the same as if they went and changed a Mustang to a Chev in real life,
Yeah, all the mount points are going to change.
kind of going to fit, but kind of going to need to re-engineer a few bits as well to make the different bodies fit.
Yeah, so at a basic level, the kind of the basic structures of the car are almost identical, but yeah, the way things mount and everything else, changes a little bit.
All right, so we go from grabbing our data from team or manufacturer land. We then modelize it, take it down to 1/18 scale, modify hinges and all the sort of bits and gubbins and things that we need to change.
Yeah.
They just simply can't be exactly the same as the real car.
No, and
mounting points and things might be, but hinges and things will be just far too flimsy.
Yeah, so if you think about it in a realistic sense, these cars are effectively 5% of the size of the real car. So if we scaled everything down to that point, you'd be dealing with hinges that are probably like 1/10 of a millimetre wide. That just wouldn't last.
Bit small.
And ultimately, the cars still need to be handleable, so they end up a bit beefier than what you'd expect. But they do actually have to be strong enough to withstand transit, strong enough to withstand handling, and maybe the occasional 3-year-old throwing them around the room, as we all know kids love to do.
Correct.
So yeah, hinges is probably the biggest thing, where we do need to make them beefy enough and function well enough that the cars will stay together, panel lines stay where they should. And that's a big part of getting the opening parts of a die-cast model correct.
The one other thing with Gen 3 that in everything you've just said has proven to be a bit of a challenge is the rear wing.
Yep.
Because it's obviously quite, compared to previous generations of supercar right back really, the wing mounts have been pretty beefy in most cases.
Yeah.
Maybe the VE was similar, but the VE was at least still a solid piece of alley, whereas now they're not solid pieces of alley. They've got big holes in the middle of them.
Yeah, they're getting smaller and smaller, and that's an aero thing more than anything else. But when we actually get to doing a model car, suddenly if you actually did it to scale, they would be so thin that it'd literally just fall apart in your hands. So we've made them as beefy as we dare, but ultimately, if you give it a good whack, you're going to knock a wing off.
Yeah.
Once again, that's just life. There's not much we can do short of actually making them look ridiculously fat. So that was a decision to make them look as close to scale as we possibly can.
But with that comes fragility.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, so we modelize the data, we get that back down, you spend an inordinate amount of time then going, this is why he's got grey hair. So you then pour over that data, we make sure that everything's where it should be, we're happy with what it looks like. What's the next step from there?
So once we've got to a point where we're reasonably happy with our model data, then we'll go and ask the factory to punch out a 3D printed sample for us. And this is sort of the first time you get to see a physical object. And that really does tell you whether you're going to have any issues in terms of fitment of things, whether the car actually looks right. Doesn't necessarily give you an idea on how strong the car's going to be, because it's plastic. It's not awesome for a strength test. But you can sort of get an idea on whether your hinge lines are going to work, whether you're going to have any issues in terms of it falling to pieces. Generally, they don't. We'll go through the same process once we've done the 3D data for that. We'll do the same process again for the 3D printed sample. Basically give the factory a whole bunch of notes. We'll modify the 3D model until we're happy with that. And then we'll basically say, right, we're good to go. Let's go and start doing a die-cast mold. And that's where we start to head towards a first shot in die-cast.
Because I guess it's a funny thing where you take something from on the screen and then you 3D print it. It's a bit like sometimes when you're writing something in Word or whatever, and you write a big long spiel and you read it and it's absolutely perfect. No spelling mistakes, no grammar errors, nothing. And then you print it out and you read it and lo and behold, the bloody thing's full of every mistake under the sun.
Yeah.
Because you just don't notice them necessarily as clearly sometimes in the virtual world as you do when it's a hard copy.
Absolutely, and that's the big issue that you can face when you're sort of doing a lot of this stuff in 3D land. your sense of scale gets kind of twisted. Like you're looking at it on a screen. You don't really have any sense of how big the parts are unless you start to measure them, which is something I end up doing quite a lot. So how thin is that?
Very thin.
So once you actually end up with a physical object, you can go, holy crap, that's really thin, or wow, that looks disgustingly fat. And so you'll end up modifying the model to look more true to scale. So yeah, there'll be things in there that you'll look at and just go, nah, we're not doing that. That looks dumb. Go and retweak it. Either make it bigger, smaller, fatter, skinnier, whatever you need to do to make it work. And that's something you really only can do once you've actually got a physical object in your hand.
And the other thing is too, when you're staring at, because we've done these two projects at the same time, effectively, you're sort of staring at the same thing twice. That's where it kind of, you can miss.
Mustang,
you can,
I don't know.
You can miss one, something on one thing and not on the other, or what. It's just it's sort of when you're concentrating on one project, I guess it's pretty easy to just follow that through.
Yeah, your focus is entirely on that car, but we're actually trying to do two simultaneously.
When they both look the same.
Yeah.
It gets a bit more difficult.
Yeah, you can run into a few issues with that, but ultimately it's not as bad an issue as you'd think it'd be.
And of course, the process that we're talking about here today is 1/18th land. But at the same time as you've been doing 1/18th land, you've also been doing 64th land, 43rd, and the 12th as well. So,
and they all have their own issues as well. Obviously, as you scale a model down, suddenly things don't work the way they did in an 18th as a 64th. The construction is entirely different, so you need to kind of keep swapping hats as you're doing things in order to get stuff out as quickly as you possibly can.
And then in 1/12th, you number one, you're going to a bigger scale, so in theory you can see more of the detail. But then it's resin as well, so that then has its own set of challenges that a die cast doesn't, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've really got to kind of make sure the right hat's on the right foot, so to speak.
And it's not as simple as like, oh, I'll just take an 18th and just scale it up. It doesn't work that way. You'll end up with something that looks super chunky. So effectively, each scale is will start from scratch. You'll take the data from the team and then make it whatever that scale needs to be. So yeah, there's not a lot of crossover between between the different scales, short of the actual outside shape
what it looks like at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got our data. We've converted it to whatever scale we need to. We've 3D printed it. We've decided that the 3D print sort of final version is what we want.
Yeah.
Then what's the next step after that?
So the next step is obviously do a die cast mold. So this is where the big bucks start to happen, because
this is where I go grey.
Yeah. To do a die cast tool, it's not a cheap exercise, and it's not a fast process. Effectively, everything you see here is made out of big steel tools that get pressed together. They feed in, molten Zamac, pull it all apart. To get that process to work, that's some interesting engineering in and of itself.
Yeah, that's an art in itself.
Yeah, and once we actually end up with a die cast sample, the first step is, does it work? Do the doors open? Do the bonnet open? Is everything going to work the way we want it to? Are there any issues that when the factory's done it, they've gone, okay, so we're going to make it work this way. There's going to be a tool that comes in from here and blah, 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 blah. Does it actually work? Is everything the way we want it to be? Because if we make a mistake now, that's going to be replicated for the rest of that tool's life. So this is where you really need to pay attention to make sure everything works right.
And there's other parts of it too, in that there's little things like the jack points in Gen 3 are now in the body.
Yeah.
And depending on what circuit we're at, depending on what session it is, they may be covered completely, or one side might be covered. Could be qualifying. They like to cover up both sides for more aero, blah, blah, blah. So, so then we've got different components inside the tools to press different things.
Yeah, so you need to have a bit of versatility in that respect, and so we'll end up with different inserts and slides so that we can either have air jacks one side or the other, no air jacks. And all of that adds to the complexity of the tool as well, because they all need to work in conjunction with each other, ultimately so that you can end up with something that you can make suit whatever round it is, whatever race it was.
Whatever direction it is.
Yep, and the same goes with fuel fillers and everything else inside the car as well. That all is interchangeable and crosses over.
Well, and I guess from a bodywork perspective, just purely the die-cast shell, we don't have to worry about fuel fillers in Gen 3.
No.
Unlike every other supercar we've ever made, because that's now in the window. And because of the plastic nature of the windows, we just have two.
Yeah.
We just have one, or we've got four.
Yeah.
Is it there? Is there a hole there, or is there not a hole there? But all the gubbins and things inside the cars, that's all the stuff that gets replicated twice, and it just depends if it's left or right.
Yeah, so effectively we end up with a left and a right-handed pair for all the fuel fillers and vents, and a left or right-hand pair of the rear glass. So you can either have it with the cutout for the fuel filler, or it's clear, depending on what they're doing. A lot of the super sprints, we're not doing pit stops anymore, so they just get clear glass on them. So all of that needs to be integrated into the model as well. Does make it a little bit more complex, but that's the nature of the beast. That's the nature of supercars.
Correct. All right, so we've now effectively got a model.
Yeah, we've rubber stamped it. Right, let's go.
And we certainly hope by the stage we get to when we have these bare metal versions, we're not changing much from here.
You'd think that, wouldn't you?
This is where a lot of hope and praying starts.
Yeah.
Really, by the time we get to this stage, it's more, as you said, it's the fitment of the doors, it's the really fine detail stuff. We're not turning the thing upside down, hopefully.
Yeah.
It's just making sure that everything fits and
Yeah.
then we can polish glass. You'll notice with these first shots that the glass isn't clear, but by the time we get to a deco sample or a production sample, the windows are clear. That's just simply a polishing process of the tools, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So when they machine them, it's basically a CNC machine and it'll go and make whatever shape is required, but they're not going to spend the time to polish it until we actually green light it. So the first shots that we get down usually have that cloudy glass look, and one of the last processes they'll do is to polish all of those molds so you end up with nice clear glass.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you say, like once we get to that point, if you're changing the model, you've really made a big stuff up.
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, it's like, oh, that door doesn't quite fit the way we want it to. We just need to modify that hinge a little bit. You know, it's really just fiddling around.
Fine stuff.
Yeah, and ultimately, once we get to that point, we're already thinking ahead to the next step, which is decoration.
What's the next step, Greg?
Oh, it's decoration.
Oh, perfect.
So once we've actually got a tool that we can now punch cars out with, we'll go and ask them to start doing decorated prototype samples, and that's where we send them decorated file, all the photos we can possibly think of, any other information that we can give them, and then they'll actually start to make cars that look like the actual cars. That's a process in and of itself, and once we get to that point, effectively the tool is fixed. We can change a few little bits here and there, but that creates another problem. But effectively, once we get to that point, we're done.
But yeah, at this stage, it's more is it left or right for the air jack? Is it left or right for the fuel filler? That sort of stuff. It's not. Yeah, it's not wholesale change.
No, and that basically feeds into the decoration sample. So each car is considered to be an entity in and of itself. So part of that, as you do the decoration, is you'll tell them, I want a fuel filler on this side, I want an air jack on this side, and that's all part of the deal of doing that specific car.
All right, so that effectively gets us to the production stage for the cars. And we've already done a bit of a video on the Penrite cars, the Penrite Mustangs, of sort of how we get through the deco process. So if you're interested in that,
check that out.
We'll try and put a card somewhere, maybe. I don't know how to do that, but we'll work it out. I've heard people say it on the internet. So we've got to the point now with both of the brands, with the Camaro and with the Mustang, that we're in production phase now. We're done from a tooling perspective, fingers crossed. We're punching out cars. So what's the big differences between what we've got now with Gen 3 and where we were with more so our Gen 2 Mustang, because our ZB was a resin model, so that's kind of a little bit of a different story. But in terms of opening part diecast, what sort of are the differences between the Gen 2 and Gen 3?
Okay, so let's grab a Gen 2.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
Ultimately, in terms of an external setup, they're pretty much the same. The big difference that is most noticeable is the fact that Gen 2 Mustang has an opening boot. Gen 3 cars don't have an opening boot. And the reason for that is if you actually go and have a look at a real Gen 3 supercar, the boot doesn't have a hinge on it. It's a fully removable panel.
Yep.
So for us to do that as a car, as a scale model, you'd end up with basically a hatch that floats around.
More loose bits.
More loose bits to lose. Trying to get the fitment of that is going to be a bit janky. So we made the decision to basically seal the boot so we can get the tail to look right, and also kind of hang on to the wing properly.
And it's hanging onto the wing is one of the biggest issues. Yeah. But also it also comes down to what potential damage could happen to the models on the way down.
Oh.
And that's where, we want to minimize that as much as we can. So having a loose boot floating around, or panel, because it's not even a boot, it's a panel, floating around in the box, not ideal from any stretch of the imagination. Just things like chipping them and chipping the paint off or chipping a decal or something like that. It's just not. It's not something we want you guys to have to deal with, let alone us have to deal with.
Anytime you've got a raw edge, like if you did a hatch.
The lights have gone out. Oh no, we will press on. We will endeavour to press on.
Anyway, I thought the lights were going out on me. Anytime you've got a raw edge like a hatch or something like that, that's so prone to getting chipped and everything else, like you say, it's just not worth doing. And the other point is, if you actually have a look inside the boot of a supercar, there's nothing there. It's basically just a big box, and that's about it. So
and it was like that with Gen 2 as well, or even back to VF and FG, and then slowly teams started to put stuff back in. So that's where we went when we got to Gen 2 Mustang. We opened the boot again, but with Gen 3, again, teams can't move anything around. So there's really nothing in there. There's nothing homologated to be in there. Yeah. Nothing's going to change. So that's the primary reason that we sealed it up. Yeah. And then second to that, it just avoids damage.
Yeah, it adds a lot of stiffness to the structure at the back of the car, so it makes it actually easier to die cast as well. There was really no decent reason to have an opening hatch on the back of the car.
Yeah. All right. So other improvements, I guess, and just feature differences between what I've got in my hand and what's sitting on the table.
Yeah, probably the one that's most notable is the wheels. Back when we did Gen 2 and previous things like VF and FGX, they were a wheel that was screwed onto the car and then had a wheel nut chucked on it. With Gen 3, they've got a completely different wheel nut setup, so we've had to modify the way that works. The wheels are effectively now a press fit onto the car. We have had a few issues with the tolerances on those wheels not being as good as they could be. Occasionally they fall off, but thankfully they can press back on, which is really easy.
There you go, Garth. You can do your Sandown car.
Internally, the engine bay is entirely different now. So between the Chev and the Mustang, the way the engines are set up, basically with a throttle body and an airbox well forward, that means there's a whole lot more detail inside the engine bay than there was before.
Yep.
Especially going back to the previous cars where they had massive airboxes, there's kind of nothing to see. So there's a lot more detail in the engine bay than we've ever done before. There's a lot more stuff going on in a Gen 3 car overall anyway. And internally, we've gone a bit more hardcore in terms of fitting it out with, cool boxes and fans and everything else in there that we were a little bit limited to do on Gen 3 because everything was moving around. You kind of can't put stuff in there and then go, oh, actually, these guys have shifted it over there.
Even down to sort of in this era of car, they moved to kind of having those bigger sponsor boards and things in the passenger's footwell and what have you, and we kind of retrofitted them into these. Yeah. With varying levels of success, but we've kind of been able to commit with these. Yeah,
because everything's very much fixed in stone. We can, with reasonable surety go, right, that's going to be the way it goes in the car, and we've gone to town on that sort of thing. So internally, there's a lot more detail as well. Yeah, overall, there's a lot more to look at if you spend the time to look at it. Not to mention, yeah, the new shapes are kind of cool as well. And to the point, if you go down to finer detail, the previous cars had bonnet pins that were sticking out of the body shell and were quite regularly knocked off. These all have flush bonnet pins, so they're actually a photo etched steel hatch pin, which adds a little bit of extra detail. So yeah, so we've just kind of gone through it and made sure we've got as much cool stuff to look at as we possibly can.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. All right, so we've covered off the differences really between Camaro and Mustang as well. So I guess then we get down to the dirty P word.
Oh, don't.
Not so much on your side of the desk. Your side of the desk was okay. It's more my side of the desk that seemed to cop it.
Yeah, weird.
Yeah,
right?
weird, right?
So you think?
Yeah, I've only got about 5 different versions of that rear wing, so why not have more for this side too?
Yeah, and the big issue with the dirty P word is we never quite knew what was going to happen until afterwards. So,
And we had that problem with that
oh yeah,
as well.
yeah, like the 50 million wings for the Gen 2 Mustang. Yeah, it was always like, oh, okay, which wing is this? What are we doing?
When should we actually start?
Yeah, and the big issue with this is you can really only start modifying a tool once you actually know what the parity change is going to be.
And how long it's going to be for.
Yeah, is it actually worth retooling? So, case in point with these, once they started to modify the front bumper, we're looking at a whole new front tool, and that's not cheap. And we couldn't really start until we'd actually seen what was actually going to go onto the cars.
Yep.
There was a whole lot of conjecture about what was going to be there and how it was going to work, but until you actually know, you can ascertain for real.
Yep.
You're shooting in the dark, so you might as well just wait and see what happens.
Yeah.
That then has the knock-on effect of delaying actual production of the car because they've got to make it all work before we actually go into production.
Yeah.
So that really does stymie the process.
And it limits sort of what we're actually able to do in terms of which cars we could pick to do from last year in particular, because again, there was the original car, then there was the Townsville car, then there was the Gold Coast car.
Yeah.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
I feel like that was it. And then there's this year. And we
Yeah.
won't even worry about this year just yet.
Yeah.
But it just meant that sort of, we obviously announced a lot of our cars quite late last year, or later than we ordinarily would. We like to get out what we're going to do early in the year, but we just had this niggling feeling, fairly well
It was almost
known.
instantaneous. Yeah, like the minute we started to see them race, we're like, oh, okay, this is something's going to change here. And until you know what it is,
It makes it hard.
you got to sit on your hands.
We were somewhat fortunate that in some areas we could kind of get away with it. So in terms of rear wings are always plastic components, so not the alloy die cast, and it's the alloy die cast that's kind of the hardest to change and modify. The other thing that we sort of knew was going to change, and again, it's kind of just lucky we did it this way. It was good luck, not good grace. Was the what's the word I'm looking for? Side skirts. So with the side skirts on the Mustang in particular, it's probably easier if I grab the black one. You can see that it's got quite a large kick behind the door, and that is sort of the bit that changed, fortunately. And that we'd actually already tooled in plastic, which meant that we could easily modify it. Oh, sorry, not modify it, just make another one.
Make another one.
So that we had the 2 different versions.
Yeah.
Where it got more difficult,
Front bumper.
the front bumper.
Yeah.
Because the front bumper doesn't come off like this.
No.
Might on the real thing, but it doesn't on our diecast.
Not on a model. No. So that is effectively a new tool slide. So they'll basically be able to slide between, original setup and what we call parity 1, and they'll basically modify what's going into the thing by sliding one tool across to make a different bumper.
So maybe we can quickly explain that with the die cast, particularly for a body shell like this, it's not just one tool. It forms one tool, but you've got to think of it as you've got to be able to get the piece, you've got to release the piece from the mold itself. So there's actually sort of a back clip, a front clip, a top clip, and some side clips.
Side clips, underclip.
And an underclip.
Yeah, so there's about 8 different tooling parts that all get pressed together.
Inject, and then fall apart.
Yeah, and then it's basically spring loaded to go ka-chunk, and then it all falls apart.
And this bit falls out the bottom.
Yeah,
hopefully.
And then another one, another one, another one.
So that's where it still costs a lot of money with the tool, but it has meant that we can kind of have the 2 different, well, actually, these are both the same, but the 2 different front bars, so that we've got the original season, and then we've got the version that was post-Bathurst. Yeah. So if you actually look between these 2 deco samples, this is the original car from Sydney, wasn't it? Yeah. Which was early in the year. Then this was Matt Payne's Adelaide car, but obviously ran the same livery at the Gold Coast. Yeah. And that's got the completely different front bar with
so that's got
smaller cheeks.
Stick-on infills.
Yeah, the stick-on infills on the outside, sort of wheel arch as well. Yeah. So that's the sort of the difference, even just in one single season. Yeah. In the different models we're making.
And yeah, we have no option but to basically retool another bumper slide. And if Supercars change their minds again, Supercars
Stop it.
Absolutely not. If they change it again,
Tim. I'm on to you, Tim.
Yeah. We'll need to redo another slide, and that's even more money and more complexity. So please don't
touch it. Yeah. And so the other thing was the rear wing. So again, if you look at when we've released both of these cars, which the WAU car will be first, with the Penrite cars a little later, compare the rear wing size. Yeah. Because they are different. Yeah. And you can sort of see that this is getting technically into the weeds here, but the actual car is sort of a 3D printed extension. So they've taken the end plates off, put in a couple of inch sort of extension, and then put some longer bolts.
Plates back on like a big sandwich.
And you can actually see the groove in the model, which is...
That's a nice touch.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that we planned that, but there you go, it's there.
Yeah. And that's part of the thing is when we do this stuff, if they change their cars, we've got to change our cars. And wing is not so bad because it's plastic. Side skirts, not so bad because it's plastic. But once we actually have to modify the actual physical car, that becomes a problem.
Yeah, a big problem. And the one thing that we did do if you think about how the cars are actually produced, or the parts are produced. If you think about a model kit, like a Tamiya kit or an Airfix kit, and all the parts come on a sprue inside the box, that's effectively how our cars are made as well. And because we knew parity was going to be a thing with all the Mustang stuff, we actually left room in the tools, because we knew that we'd be doing more parts.
So if you think about it, it's like, you call it a sprue, I call it a tree. Potato. Yeah. Whoever says potato. Yeah. Effectively, you'll have a big ring around that, and that's where you inject all your plastic, and all the parts go in the middle of it. If we did this and we wanted to save a few bob, we would have made that small enough just to get all the parts. But we were like, this is going to end tears. We know it's going to change. So we did a bigger tree, and then we had a couple of gates so that we can turn stuff on and off. Yeah. That just gives us a little bit of scope, but we're kind of maxed out on that tree. If we have another parity thing, I'm going to cry, because we're going to be looking at a new tree. But like, you can plan ahead only so far. But if they're going to do parity changes every 15 minutes, thankfully I hope all of that's over.
Well, hopefully the only thing from now on might be some engine tweaking, but that is all inside.
Doesn't bother me.
And that's not going to change our model.
There's no engine management system in these, so that's not a big deal for us.
As we said at the beginning, they don't start. All right, guys, I think that's about it. Obviously, if you've got any more questions, comments, get down in the comments, ask your questions away. We'll do another one of these, probably with a bit of a Q&A based on your feedback. If you like seeing our faces, hit the like button. If you'd like to subscribe, that'd also be nice.
Yeah, do it. What's the worst that could happen?
You see us more often, which people may not want to do that. Yeah. All right, guys, thanks very much for joining us. As I say, we'll do some more of these, and hopefully bring you just a little bit more insight into exactly what's involved, why when a car is on track yesterday, it's not in your model shop the next day. It just takes a bit of time.
Yeah.
And hopefully we kind of can put some meat on the bone as to why that's why it takes what it takes. All right. Thanks, guys.
Take it easy.
And buy the models.